Welcome to our lecture for this week, which is about constructing new texts. And whilst our main focus will be on writing, written texts, we will be looking at a little bit of multimodal texts and how these make meaning between writing and other features. But it also has ideas that would help us in numeracy as well. So when we're constructing text in numeracy, what sort of considerations would we have for that as well? So please see this as not just a literacy activity, but a more broad activity in the sense of schooling is when we are asking students to construct a text, what do we need to consider and how can we support the students? So we will start with writing, but again, remember to take across into other areas as well. So in terms of writing, we can start by asking what is it we ask students to write in high school and why? Why are they writing? Whether it be handwriting or electronic sources, even just recording in some way. Why do we do these sorts of things? And we have, like writing, we have a number, like reading, we have a number of reasons for writing. So we ask students to record their learning in some way. It may be what we've just given them, it may be a summary of what they've learnt. We often do that so we can check their understanding. It's a quick way of being able to see what they've written. For students, it may be to reinforce their understanding, or one of the things which I think is really important is helping them to extend their understanding. So they may have had something when they came into the room, we may be talking about something. How can they write to extend what they knew? We often think about writing as thinking, so we get the students to make I know people call them mind maps. They're not always mind maps, but diagramming in some way to construct links between ideas, so that it's helping us to not just to make marks on paper, but to think as well. So we can look at the visual representation of what's going on in our heads. Again, good way to check what's going on in their heads. We ask students to display knowledge. Now this is to various people, to themselves. So write to show what you've learned. And sometimes, I'll do this in tutorials. We ask students to write down, our quizzes, sometimes to get you to find out what you actually know and then what you need to know. It displays knowledge, of course, the teacher. It's a way of displaying for tests and, of course, exams, high stakes ways of displaying knowledge. We can ask students to do writing so they can get feedback. So they write something and we talk about it, we annotate it, so they get feedback. We also ask students to write so they can give feedback. We ask them to reflect or to think about or to say, to evaluate even. So what we are thinking about here is what are the opportunities for writing or displaying knowledge in our subject areas. And then, of course, the all-important question is how do we support these opportunities? So if we're going to give students opportunities, that's great, but how do we support them to then do this successfully? And what we want to be able to see is this relationship between reading and writing. Are we giving students rich texts for them to be able to extract meaning so that they can create rich texts? Just because you can read doesn't mean you write. You can write. Our job in the middle there is to help students to know what it is we're asking them to write. But if we're asking them to write with no reading or no way of getting information, it's a hollow sort of writing activity. So we want to give good texts that students can get information and then being asked to write good text so they can reflect the information, the learning they've had. So we can have a look now at what is writing. What is this thing that we call writing? And this definition by G is talking about marks etched on a rock that are understood by particular communities. So we know that if we make a mark on a paper, that's very arbitrary, the type of meaning we ascribe to that. So just because I go down and across, that to me in English a sense might mean a T, but that same mark might mean a plus to somebody from mathematics. It might mean a cross to somebody thinking in religious terms, and if I went into very many other communities, that symbol might mean something completely different. It might be a whole meaning, not just a letter. So the mark that we make on paper or electronically only has meaning because as a community we have agreed that that is the meaning. And so if we look at this more broadly within our discipline areas, words have meaning because we have agreed that is the meaning in that community. So our job, of course, is to think about, in our discipline, what are the marks on paper? What are the symbols? What are the letters, the numbers, the other sorts of symbol ways of making text that we use and we have meaning for? So what sort of texts have meaning for us? Which ones don't have meaning for us? So does poetry have meaning in your discipline area? In some disciplines it'll have great meaning. Some it won't be useful at all. We do not use it for meaning. So we need to think about not just the marks, those individual marks, but the text as a whole. Which texts have meaning for your disciplinary area? So if we're thinking about this movement into written language, we can think about speaking then as a way of helping to move across this continuum. So this spoken to written continuum, we can see in these examples here. If we look at text 1, if you just read that by itself and you're not there in the place, you have no idea what here is. Sitting might lead us to a chair, but we don't know what's being spoken about because we don't need to. When we're in the same place, the same time as the other person, our audience, we don't need to put too many meaning-making words in there because we have the meaning in front of us. The context is there. But as we move across maybe to text 2, we might recognise this as being a telephone conversation. So this good morning might say, oh, that person's not really, they don't know them, and they're giving their role, not their name, tech services. So already we're setting this up as a different relationship. We have to use more words that give the meaning and the situation, because the person's not there in the same time and place. And as we move into text 3 and text 4, we would recognise these as written text with the audience not there maybe in the same time at all. So in our telephone conversation we're in the same time but not the same place. In our written text we're not even in the same time, so these could have been written a long time before the audience get to interact with them. So in that case we need to put more meaning-making words in. We might use more technicality so that the person reading doesn't make a mistake. So we're very much more specific in what we're talking about. So what we have then in this continuum is a continuum of time and space and interpersonal distance. So in the first example, we're much closer physically, and therefore we don't need as much language to do the work. As we move over to text 4, interpersonally we're not there, so the distance could be huge. So we need more language to do the work that things would do. So in terms of experience, we have in the first example the language is accompanying the action. We might not even need the language. We can just do the actions. Whereas in the last one, the language there is a reflection of what we need to do. There's nothing that we've got in common, so it needs to reflect what needs to happen. So the language changes, the forms change, particularly the number of lexis words in there, lexical meaning has to be put into the fourth text. So in terms of writing, we think of writing then as typically being a crafted activity. It's more considered. We need to think what we need to say so there's no mistakes made. There's a degree of formality because we don't know who we're speaking to. It's decontextualized, the things aren't there in the same place, and it has a sense of permanency. Now these are typically what we think of as writing, but as we've sort of more electronic forms have emerged, of course, this permanency and this the formality has changed, and there's people doing all sorts of research on this with emails, and then of course with text messages. And I know that I have spent too long on the internet looking for examples to illustrate this point with much hilarity. Of course, I've put the PG rated ones on here, but we know that autocorrect is doing all sorts of things to our text. It's already doing the work for us, or trying to. And because we don't spend that time considering what we write, it's fleeting, we're doing it quickly, it doesn't matter too much if we make a mistake, depending on who we send it to, of course, that, you know, our language becomes less formal, technical, specialised just because we wrote it down. So our situation then is really important, is when we come to another situation, then we might need to teach the skills of proofreading, checking, making sure it's clear, knowing the person, realising the person is not just our mate who understands that that's an autocorrect mistake. So we need to think of writing as, again, across a continuum as well of formality. So these more electronic forms have changed the way that we think about, we can theorise about writing. So let's get back to our register then. We have this, we talked a little bit about field, tenor and mode, and we can see this then when we start looking at writing, that in terms of field, our topic, we have a continuum of this sort of common sense language, everyday language, and we can move into more highly specialised and technical language. So when we're asking students to write about a topic, what sort of words do we want them to choose? Do we want them to speak in a everyday way, or do we want them to speak in the sort of specialised way that they may be getting from their reading, of course, as well? So we might use talk to unpack into everyday language, but then we probably want the students to repack back into the technical when they come to write. And in terms of tenor, in terms of relationship, do we want it to be informal, as though they're chatting, or do we want the students to write in ways that are formal and impersonal with more distance? Do we want them to write in a way that doesn't assume a particular audience, or does assume a particular audience, and that will place us somewhere along the tenor continuum as well? If I say to the students, I want you to write this as though you're telling your friend, that pushes the students into an informal tenor. If you ask the students to write as though you're speaking to another expert, that will push them up into the formal, impersonal sort of way. So we can help the students by telling them who the audience is, who the imagined audience might be. And in terms of mode, do we ask the students to support their writing with images or objects itself, so it's more concrete? Do we want the students to support their writing with a flowchart or something that shows how this meaning is supposed to be unpacked? Or do the students need to rely on just the language, in which case that will ask them to do something different to the language, where it's decontextualised, it's not with an object that is being described. So in terms of the mode, the students need to know what types of ways they're going to express this information. Is the mode going to be a video, in which case you can do different things? So I can do different things with this text called the lecture, because I know that you are watching it, that you hopefully watching it, that it's relating back to the PowerPoint. So what I'm doing is constructing my spoken text to match the written text on the PowerPoint. Because it is PowerPoint, I know that I can use animations in particular ways, so I'm constructing the text to unfold the information in a particular way because of the animations. So these sorts of, the mode helps students to think about how they're going to construct the field, and also the sort of tenor that they're taking up. So in terms of register, Halliday, who came up with this theory, of course, tells us that we have many choices then, that things can move just because the field is highly specialised. Does that mean the tenor is also, that end can it be a bit further back along the continuum? Probably won't go all the way back to informal, that would be a bit strange. Informally chatting in a highly specialised way may cause some confusion. So we tend one way, but we have choices across this, and particularly with mode, we might have highly specialised information, but the mode is a way that we can interact. So in a lecture, for example, that was face-to-face, because I can see the audience, I will adapt and change my tenor because I can get feedback in a way I can't do here, because I don't know if you're watching or sleeping, or if you've gone to do something else. So I can't get that feedback. So because of this mode, I can't adjust the tenor. So in terms of the choices that we can make with helping students into the text, we need to think about where are they on the mode, just to help, just to give them some advice about how we want it written. As an example, yesterday I had an email from the school I work with with one of those email trails where one teacher is disputing the other teacher, and the first teacher's trying to back up their choice by using me, by CCing me in. And the first teacher has said, oh, we don't want rhetorical devices, we don't want to be asking questions inside the text, we don't want that, so we don't want that to happen. So this was a tenor problem. Although it was making an argument, and you could ask rhetorical questions inside an argument, that's a way of making an argument. The first teacher didn't want that to happen. They didn't, and what they were really saying is they don't like the tenor of that asking a question. Is this important? We could ask this. The second teacher was saying, yes, we can, because Mari said, but which is not a reason to do it. But it does fit inside persuasive text to ask rhetorical questions, but the first teacher didn't like that tenor, really. So that's a choice that teachers can make or fight about over email. I'm staying right out of it. I'm going to let them choose. However, this is the thing, when teachers can recognise what does worry them, what does upset them, you can tell the kids, don't do these things. It's probably fairer than just getting upset. We hope to be doing that with your assignments, of course. So in terms of an everyday example, maybe we can have a look at an everyday example just to understand Register a little bit better. Let's go to chocolate chip cookies then. When we look at this text, it's set up in the field that we would expect to be expecting. It's got technical words, as in the type of food that we use. In terms of the instructions, they're set out fairly clearly. In this case, the steps are grouped together, not broken down as they could be into lots and lots of steps. They've been grouped together in phases of the recipe, which is sort of interesting. We have this little piece of advice at the top here, again in imperative mode, and imperative language, I should say. And at the end, there's a little note there about what, a little extra piece of information. And what's interesting, of course, being on the internet, one of the affordances of the internet is that we can use these visual texts as well, videos. So if you were to watch the video, you get jaunty music, not somebody telling you, so not language in the background. There's no oral text, except for jaunty music, which probably makes you feel happy to be making chocolate chip cookies. You do get the words, some language inside the video, so you know not just what to do, but how much. It's sort of important, so you don't have to go back to the recipe. So both of these texts can stand alone. However, if you're not really clear on the words, you could go into the video. So they can support each other, but neither are necessary to make. You only need to use one to make the meaning of the rest, to make the biscuits. But in terms of tenor, it's apart from the jaunty music, it's quite impersonal in terms of it's just giving very clear instructions. If I go to something like Nigella Lawson making our chocolate chip cookies, this time buckwheat, for the gluten-free community members, the way that Nigella Lawson, of course, constructs her recipes is a high on the interpersonal. It's very much about you coming into my world, my beautiful world, and making this so you can be somewhat like me. So when we look at the way the recipe is written, we know that it's going to have, we can expect it's going to have the ingredients, going to have the instructions, so it's going to be set up in the same way, so the mode is similar, it's on the internet. However, in terms of what goes on inside the language, the interpersonal is quite different. So what we end up, we've got the steps again, more steps, but basically the same sort of thing, and yet we get all of this, I do this, and it's a little bit of, the use of brackets, just a little aside, so you're in on the act with me. I find this, I do. This is a very different interpersonal, or very different text interpersonally. So in terms of field, it's the same. It just happens to be gluten-free. But in terms of the interpersonal, it's quite different. In terms of mode, it's quite similar. You can, I haven't put the link there, but we can see down the bottom here, you can watch a video of her doing this. I haven't watched that, but I imagine she's talking. I would imagine that's what's happening, because Nigella Lawson's, the way that she creates text is very much impersonal and talking to you like a friend. So we have the same field but a different tenor, the same mode. So in terms of register, the topic, what it's about, the relationship that's being built and the way it's presented, we can see that they're both about chocolate chip cookies, albeit gluten-free in the second text. In the first one, it's that expert to apprentice. It's fairly impersonal. In fact, when we have the video, we just see hands, we don't see a person, so it's impersonal. In terms of the second text, though, is where the big change is. It's a closer, it's a more personal, it's the writer's own relationship with the biscuits that you two can be part of. So we're drawn into a world, and so we could look at the ways that's done, both in the video but also in the text, in the words itself. So it's not just the video, it's the words that create that different tenor. In terms of mode, the first one has written and then a video text to support. In terms of the second text, the mode is sort of interesting. We have a picture of the author. So we have this, where, again, it's helping to build the tenor. The mode has changed to bring this picture of the biscuits, but also of the author as well. So it's doing something different. So we might be thinking about, what are we asking students to do when they're constructing texts? What is it about the field? What is it about the tenor? What is it about the mode? How much of the continuum do you want when you're asking students to construct these texts? So when we're writing text across the curriculum, we're asking you to consider the discourse of your discipline when setting the task. So when we say consider, we want you to think about, to analyse and be ready to teach. And when we're talking about discourse, again, G tells us it's the stretches of language which hang together to make sense to that community. So back to our idea of community. So what makes sense to that community? So in terms of our discipline, in terms of register, we want you to consider, what do you want the students to write in your discipline and in particular situations inside your discipline, and what register makes sense to your discipline and to particular situations. So if you're writing a lab report about an experiment, you might want it very impersonal and very straight down the line, technical. I don't want the kids, I just want to know what you did, and do you understand the science behind it? And then we might ask the kids to now explain that same concept to in a fun way to an audience on the internet, and then they're taking the same content, but they're doing something else with it. So which particular situation inside your discipline? Does it make sense to rewrite science for an everyday audience? Well, that's done a lot in science. We only look at the type of TV shows where we're trying to give people access to the science. Where else does that happen? Does it not happen in some disciplines? So again, our discipline has a way of thinking about its own content, and then it has different purposes for that content, and then the register may change. So we've got all these things, it's a bit like all these cogs, moving wheels. We need to stop it at some point and say, that's what we want for this situation. Then we move them, we say, and over here we want this sort of configuration of field, tenor and mode, these purposes having an impact on that situation. So it's a lot to think about, but if we spend some time thinking about this, we can give kids better advice about what we want them to write. They can be more successful, we'll be happier, of course. It's a little bit like that building term, measure twice, cut once. So do the thinking deeply, so we only have to give one set of instructions, of course. And so in terms of the sort of writing, we do have this, we have short writing and long writing, not very technical, but we tend to ask kids to do short writing where we might have lists and notes and answers to these things called comprehension questions, to identify, to comment on things, to give true, false, to enclose exercises where they find the word in the gap. Maybe we ask them to predict. So what happens is we're sort of saying, some of these can be sentences, write the answer in a full sentence, but there could be other forms of writing. I sort of don't know why we would ask kids in comprehension questions to write a whole sentence when it's clearly just finding the answer. But I think later we could do our note taking and then form sentence. I think might be more useful. But indeed, we need to think about, we're asking kids just to write words, groups of words, sentences, paragraphs. What level are we asking kids to write these short pieces? And again, how formal should they be? How much technical meaning are they making there? Do we want to bring in how much can they take from the text to put into their answers? This idea of writing in their own words is really a nonsense. We don't want them to write in their own words. We want them to get some of the words they just read about and craft that into sentences or paragraphs in some way. So what we might mean by this is the students may read something like this, which is a recount built around a timeline, information about the tobacco industry. And then after that, the students are asked to understand and apply. So we have a comprehension questions here. So it's a reading task, but my interest is, what are we asking the kids to write? How do they answer? So for example, what does describe mean? How much detail do you want for describe? Do you want them just to copy what they just read? What do you want them to do to describe in terms of the views about smoking in these different years? So it's an interesting one because it's quite high level to take what happened and then think about what the views underpin that. That's actually it's usually not a number one question. But again, what do we mean by describe? When it says what evidence, how do we construct that answer? How do we say what evidence? How do we explain the evidence for? So even when we think these are short answers, there may be some prompts that we can help the kids with. And when we say explain your own view, how much of I do you want in there? How much of the text do you want into their views? This is a really important thing for kids to understand. They may just give the view they had before they came into the room, in which case, why would you do that? So it needs to be clear to the kids we want to get something from the text to give this view. And it says, considering what you've learnt about the story of tobacco, how do we put that in for the answers? I think one of the problems, of course, is often at this point the kids just go and answer the question, so it becomes a test rather than a learning activity. So probably more useful for the kids in terms of both understanding the content and the literacy of the content is to work through these questions with the kids. I think that would be great to do these more often with kids rather than just make it a test of what they remembered or what they can find out by themselves. And just in terms of this, these question prompts here, we've got state, and then specify. Are these the same? We've got list as well. What do we mean by these? So they may be quite understood in the discourse of your discipline. We want to be clear the kids understand that as well. What does state mean here and what might it mean somewhere else? How much information? And so we can look at some of the prompts, and people have done a lot of research on these sort of ideas, particularly looking at HSC. Becomes quite guessing what's in the head of the assessor. But when we ask to analyse, usually it's about breaking it into parts, identifying the components and showing the relationship between the parts. That's usually what we mean by analyse. So we can help kids by saying, well, there's words like, prompts such as consists of, contains, additionally, as well as, consequently, combined. That these are some examples of words we can help the kids to know and to use when we analyse. And in terms of evaluate, about taking a position, showing contrasting positions, making a judgment, including evidence. So we have words that fit in: should, must, if we're taking a position, how strongly we want to take that position, detrimental, necessary, important. Again, additionally, in this case, when we add more information, for example, another reason, in contrast, on the other hand. So even though we might be evaluating in a subject that's not English, it doesn't hurt to take some time to think about where these words might fit in to help the kids to focus their thinking. To illustrate. Illustrate's a funny one. We don't mean to draw, of course. It's to show a rule or principle through examples or instances, usually. May include graphics. So an example of, shown through, exemplified by. That's a good one to teach them. Therefore, and justify, which is a little bit different to evaluate. So you're just giving one side. You've got the examples and the evidence still. So you've got some of the words from evaluate, but you're doing something slightly different. So these are these come up again as short text, but by helping kids to know what language helps form the response to this thinking, can just help them with their literacy and then help them to work with your discipline area area in more detail. In terms of longer texts, of course, makes it a little bit more difficult. These are often the high-stakes assessment where the students have to write an extended text. It's often the essay or the assignment. It can be the culmination of a unit of work, so there's lots of good information, but it's just how we organise it in some way. So the question is, when do we teach the language that goes into these texts? And of course, we also want to think about what students know before they get to high school. Working with Year 7 and 8 I found very interesting because I know what they did at primary school because I used to teach it. So I can sort of tap into what they remember from primary school. And particularly in Year 7, they probably haven't forgotten it. But I found it really interesting how much kids go, oh yeah, they do remember. So if we do know what they did in primary school, they've often done quite long texts in primary school, you'd be surprised. They come into Year 7 and there's been some interesting research to look at how the kids actually write shorter texts in Year 7 and 8 than they do in grades 6, 5 and 6 particularly. So we want to capitalise on what they've already got before they come to high school, not lose it and then pretend they have to start all over again. So this is, for example, a stage 3 text. This is something a kid wrote in grade 6. So this is the example of how long the texts are. And it might be the best text in the world, but it does make an argument. It makes a discussion of the situation. So this is the sort of text of grade 6, and I know have taught grade 6 and grade 5. This is an expectation we might have of kids. And this one here is another example. So please don't think that they're starting anew when they come to high school. They've already had high expectations of what they're writing in primary school. So we can capitalise on that. So if we go back to our model from Martin and look at our different levels of text, we want to pull this out and think about what are our purposes of text, and therefore we're starting to understand that idea of register. What type of field, tenor and mode do we want? So the purpose might be the same, but the way we ask the students to both organise it into a mode, the type of tenor we're asking for, and how specialised may change under that purpose. And then looking at, then we come down to what sort of texts are we asking, how do we construct the texts, what happens in the paragraphs, what happens at sentence and word level, and in fact what sorts of sounds and symbols might we be using to help us. So a lot of work that's been done, particularly out of Sydney, and it's now gone global of course, over the years, has been to try and understand texts, give them a name, and look for the key grammatical features, language features we could think about as well. So if we're looking at information reports, an information report is there to classify. So the genre is to classify and define in some way. We use this language at the sentence word level. In terms of the whole text, we might organise it this way with a general statement, and then a number of descriptions or a number of attributes. We don't need a conclusion, so this is where introduction, body, conclusion doesn't really help as much. I'd say if you're coming up with the text, talk about the phases of the text. So in the first phase we want a general statement, and then after that we want various characteristics defined and explained, and we want to use this sort of language. If we're looking at something like a factual recount, again we're looking at particular language features, and in terms of the phasing we might want an orientation, and then a recount will go through and explain in terms of time the chronology, so sequence. So in terms of text purposes, this is a very common one for high school, there's response texts. However, we can break this down. Is it a personal response? Is it a review? Is it a character analysis? Is it an interpretation? Is it a critical response? Now you might think, I've never heard of these, or oh yeah, we use those in my discipline. So personal responses may be used in quite a few disciplines, in the humanities particularly. They turn up in all sorts of places, and again they have a particular a way of organising them, but also you can imagine straight away the tenor is much more personal because it's a personal response, and yet we probably want some layer of technicality in the field, but our tenor may be more personal. Whereas these other types of responses might not be asking for any type of comment, so the tenor changes. we can also look at explaining. Okay, I want them to explain something. What sort of explanation do you want? Do you want a sequential explanation? Do you want a causal explanation? This first one, sequential, doesn't have cause and effect. It just says what happens after this, after this, after this. Whereas a causal explanation, you want a level of, well, it happens because of this, and then when that happens, this happens because of this. A factorial explanation, a number of causes, a consequential explanation. So not only do we have explanation, particularly in secondary school, we have different situations, so we change, our purpose becomes more refined, really. So I'm just putting these up as examples because they're all over the internet. You can find them all sorts of places. I, of course, ask you to go to some much more academic or reliable places, but we do know that texts become more, as we work through high school, we have more thinking, so our texts become a little bit more intricate, complicated, and multimodal. We may have some explaining and then we have some response. So the texts move around the different, throughout from the top to the bottom, we may have a number of purposes inside the text. So we need to recognise this so we can help the kids to know the purpose, to know the register, and then we can think about the words they're going to use to respond to that. So let's just quickly look at one for history. The purposes in history do change across schooling, and the language, of course, reflects that. So what we tend to find in history is that towards in the early talking about history, it's more about recounting, and then we start to evaluate history and we take positions. And this rather lovely diagram is showing how the lexical density then of texts in the history genres changes across schooling. So as kids are becoming older, going through school, upwards we hope, the lexical density of their text is increasing, with a few little pops down, but also the genres are changing, the purposes. So at the beginning, in the early years, we're looking at recording and describing history. Describe what happened, say what happened, put it into a recount. And so the lexical density, because that sort of text at that level, it's not so dense. It's the technical words are there, but not to the same degree that as we get into the as we'd expect in the higher years of high school. That what we're doing in history now is explaining and arguing about history, and usually the texts will start to become more lexically dense as the kids are packing more meaning into it and using things, nominalised forms like colonisation, exploration, navigation. And probably even more technical sorts of nominalised forms than that. So not only are the genres changing, the purposes for doing the purposes around the subject changing, it means that the language becomes more packed in some ways. So when you're looking at your text that you're offering students, you need to see what's happening inside the text, and then when we're asking kids to write, we need to make clear what the purpose for this is and helping them to come to grips with the language that goes inside. And I would say, if you are interested in this, that the Christie and Daryl Wianka book has some really interesting work around some of the topic, the school disciplines, and also there's an earlier one by Christie and Martin which talks about changes in science, that movement in science and history and English, so that's quite interesting for those people who want to follow that up in their areas. And of course we would say in terms of teaching, we can't overestimate the idea, the importance of modelling, showing students when they come to do the writing, not just the text they read, but what is it you're going to write, what does it look like in terms of the text. You might show them the whole text, or you may show them, as we'll be doing with you, showing you what goes into the phases of the text, so that you know what's happening. So what we can do with these ones, I do this a lot with students, is to give them a text and they pull it apart, what's happening inside this text. But again, we can look at if this is and this text here is one I constructed for use in grade 8, a grade 8 class, to look at making an argument. Just the one argument. So we could look at that. So in terms of purpose, what are we trying to do with the text? So we can make that, we're going to argue. Our purpose is to argue for or against our suburb. I had another text actually with this, which was why it was my suburb was not the best, why it was terrible. So anyway, our situation then, when we talk about a situation, so we want to know what it's about. How will I talk to the audience? Will I be there as their friend, as an expert? How strong will I be about this? And what will I use? Will I use just words? Will I use pictures? Will I be referring to the pictures? Is it on the web? So again, the situation for this, our purpose is to say whether our suburb is good or bad, and then we say what are we going to do? It may be a spoken text, in which case we'll use different resources to do that, and our tenor may change. So again, making really clear to the kids what the situation for that purpose. And then we can look at the whole text, and the whole text level, how is it structured? You know, what comes first, what comes in the middle, what comes, what are we doing there to create our argument? How are we going to finish off the text? Do we finish off the text? What do we do throughout the text? At a paragraph level, we might look at what the connecting words are inside the paragraph. We might look at peel, that we make a point and then we bring up the evidence. How do we show the evidence is connected to the first sentence? At a sentence level, we might look at how we can elaborate ideas, what sort of words, groups of words we put inside. And then in terms of word level, we might look at the topic words, the words that drive the topic. So we may be able to look at that in a lesson, look at the sorts of words we would use. Not just about the topic, of course, but also the topic of the, or the purpose. So if I'm going to be there to convince, what sort of words do I use to convince, like should, fantastic, that sort of thing. So looking at evaluative words. So we might not teach everything, or we may have a number of lessons then around the model text, so the kids can pull out these things, and then that helps them with constructing their own text. Particularly for longer text, this is really important. And for this idea, where we use this wheel of instruction, this pedagogy for writing, it's very useful for other subjects as well. So this idea that we start with negotiating the field, where we build understanding of the field. We do deconstruction, where we're looking at texts, we're looking at the field, we're pulling it out, we're taking a look at what's going on there. We'll have some joint construction, or sometimes this is called building the field, where we work together to build joint understandings of how the text works, what would go into the text, what sorts of meanings, and then we have this chance where students do it themselves, but relying on the sort of things that we've built in these first two phases. And anybody doing numeracy, you might like to look at, or wants to look at literacy in maths particularly, you might want to look at some of these activities here for building the field in mathematics. So negotiating and pulling apart, for joint construction of understandings in mathematics. So kids can use the words and the phrases in math. So if you would go into this link here, you'll start to see the sorts of activities we might want to do to help kids to understand the field, or to understand the topic better, so they can do something with it. So in terms of this support, there has been some arguments against giving kids this sort of support and coming up with frameworks for texts and putting text into these sort of what some people see as strict. I don't think they need to be that strict, but in terms of frameworks, that it's stifling creativity, that it's not being critical of the power relationships that are built into these texts by saying this is the revered text or the powerful text, not examining that closely enough. I guess in counter to that, I would say that there's a lot of others would say that really providing some sort of framing and showing kids the way into these texts actually enables them to understand the requirements. So in terms of equity, it means that the students do have access to powerful genres. So there are things that people do value in terms of text construction, like the exam, in our community. So the more information we can give kids about that, I think it gives them a way of just not having to guess what's in our heads, or some kids have already got it because that's the way they do it at home. I think there is a really powerful equity argument here. And what's more, it fits in with our QTF element of explicit criteria, which is part of the sorts of things that organise our work. So I will leave you with a few interesting, useful references, and wish you well in thinking about the way we ask students to construct text.